A few months ago I made a video where I talk about the Wolverine game currently in development by Insomniac. Lately I've been thinking a lot about the recently announced Wolverine game. Yeah, that one. In it I bring up X-Men Origins Wolverine and how awesome it is. And that got me thinking, it's been a while since I've played X-Men Origins Wolverine, so I decided to stream it. Did you know that I often stream games on this very channel? Why not hit the bell to be notified of when I go live? Or follow me on twitch.tv/DiegoRiveraPlays. Then, after playing X-Men Origins Wolverine, I thought, I can't have a channel dedicated to covering comic book video games and not cover one of the best comic book video games of all time. So here we are. X-Men Origins Wolverine was released on April 29th, 2009, and it's one of those games that completely catches you by surprise with how good it actually is. There was no reason to believe this game would be worth your time. First and foremost, it's a movie tie-in game, and unless you're a sucker like me, right-minded people overlook these kinds of games because more often than not they're rushed projects haphazardly put together to meet a deadline, and end up being a shallow and generic beat-em-up, with rare exceptions of course. Not to mention that the movie absolutely sucked. I can understand being excited to play the tie-in game for a movie like Batman Begins. You're walking out the theater pumped on how incredible the movie was, and you see a GameStop across the street advertising the Batman Begins official video game. So the next logical step is to purchase the Batman Begins official video game and have a more intimate and involved experience. Side note, the Batman Begins official video game rules. But after walking out of the X-Men Origins Wolverine movie, I had very little motivation to pursue anything having to do with that franchise. I mean, remember the slapstick comedy routine involving Wolverine's cartoon-looking ass claws? Despite the film's quality, X-Men Origins Wolverine Uncaged Edition defied all expectations and gave us what I consider one of the best comic book video games of all time. After literally jumping headfirst into this game and gutting the first poor bastard I came across, I was immediately reminded why this game is so special. Like many movie tie-in games of the time, X-Men Origins Wolverine is a God of War clone. And yes, a lot of times, most of the time, God of War clones are a significantly lesser version of the franchise they're using as inspiration. But sometimes you get characters like Ghost Rider or Wolverine where there's no denying that the God of War gameplay formula would fit them perfectly. Especially with a character like Wolverine, who's a character all about being an absolute savage killing machine. Wolverine's ferocity is perfectly captured with a combat system that feels impactful, fluid, and satisfying. The Uncaged subtitle is 100% earned here because we get to see Hugh Jackman's Wolverine perform moves that just weren't possible to pull off in the movies. Over-the-top moves like Tornado Claw, Drill Claw, spinning into a group of goons like the Tasmanian Devil and slicing them into ribbons never gets old. This game also has what I would call the equivalent of the web strike introduced in Spider-Man Web of Shadows and found in just about every Spider-Man game moving forward, and that is the Wolverine Lunge. Probably the signature Wolverine move. It is intuitively implemented in this game in a mechanic where you simply lock onto an enemy with one of the shoulder buttons, hit the other shoulder button, and the next moment you're gracefully soaring through the air like you have a secret to tell the person on the other side of the room. Much like the web strike found in Spider-Man games, I believe the lunge attack should be a requirement for Wolverine games moving forward. So Insomniac, take notes. At the time of this game's release, we were still getting what I consider a neutered version of Wolverine, where he was restricted to the limitations of PG-13 violence. So an M-rated Wolverine game was a genuine surprise to me. And I think a certain level of violence is needed in anything related to Wolverine, especially a video game. I mean, the guy's main ability is to cut and stab people. Kinda hard to get around just a little bit of blood and dismemberment. Prior games like X2 Wolverine's Revenge had little to no real violence, and as a result the attacks felt like these limp dick weak slaps that are devoid of that satisfying Wolverine brutality that should be prominent. This game's visceral violence doesn't just serve as combat, but also another aspect of Wolverine that is very important, his healing factor. A big part of making the player feel like the old knucklehead in a video game is making him durable. Like we can jump into a hellstorm of bullets without giving it a second thought. I don't want to turn this game into a Let's Bully X2 Wolverine's Revenge session, but again, the game did feature Wolverine's healing factor. But it took too long to kick in and it took forever to fully recover your health bar. Logan was a total chump in that game. Origins does an excellent job of making Wolverine feel like an unstoppable killing machine, but it's well balanced enough that if you get careless, you'll quickly find yourself dead. And to go back to the visceral aspect of this mechanic, we get to see Wolverine heal his wounds in real time, and this is such a cool treat. Seeing Wolverine go from a shiny adamantium skelly man to the hunky, huge, jacked man never gets old. I can't wait to see how this is gonna look in Insomniac's Wolverine game with the power of the PlayStation 5. What's great about having an X-Men movie tie-in game is that you can have a bunch of crazy enemy types with different looks and powers even if they didn't appear in the movie, because it's set in a universe where mutants exist. So I'm not asking questions when I'm suddenly facing off against a giant rock golem or a blue teleporting alien lady. These enemies can naturally exist in this universe without having some shoehorned explanation. Even then, I do wish this game used that benefit to their advantage a bit more, because the first time you fight one of these rock monsters, it's awesome. Look at that. I wish we had gotten this in the movie, could you imagine? But then you fight one again, and again, and again, and again. I also would have loved to see more boss fights against villains that weren't in the movie, because this game is at its best when it deviates from the movie's plot, and we get to go through a frickin' Sentinel factory and fight one of the big boys in a boss fight that doesn't fall into the trope of having you face off against a colossal enemy from the waist up, or having it boiled down to one big QTE. The Sentinel is there in its full scale and glory. On the other hand, we have boss fights featuring Dollar Store Gambit, a bull ride atop the blob in the middle of a supermarket. This! I wish the game wasn't forced to adapt the movie's plot, and instead would have acted as a sequel set in the far future. Kinda like the game's opening cinematic. Actually, exactly like the game's opening cinematic. Look at how awesome this looks. A Wolverine game set in a post-apocalyptic Terminator Salvation-ass future? Yeah, just give me this game instead of having to adapt this. But hey, that's okay. At least this game has its own original ideas that expands the lore with subtle hints at future things to come.
You be careful, Miss Darkholme. That's my son you're carrying in there.
See you up top.
What you think of the name, Kurt?
Who do you guys think they're talking about? Only the real comic book fans would know. It's Gold Balls. I don't know how this game is paced out. For most of the game, you bounce back and forth between two time periods. One some few years in the past in the jungles of Africa, and the other during the present day in the labs and military complexes of Alkali Lake. Each level offers elements like environmental puzzles and light platforming, which do keep things fresh to a certain extent. But when you're 4 hours into a linear game and the next level takes you back to one with set dressing that makes it indistinguishable from the very first level of the game, it starts to make you wish that there was a bit more variety to these environments. Again, which is why the Sentinel Factory is such a standout level. Like any good comic book video game, XO Wolverine has alternate costumes that can be unlocked by collecting hidden action figures throughout the levels. And the only correct way to play this game is to instantly put on the classic yellow costume as soon as you unlock it, and I will not hear otherwise! An interesting extra layer to unlocking costumes is the fact that you have to go up against and defeat a version of Wolverine wearing the costume that you've collected the action figures for. There are no pushovers either, so it makes it feel that much more earned. But this only works here because there's only like 3 unlockable costumes. Imagine having to do this in Marvel's Spider-Man. The team at Raven Software poured their efforts into X-Men Origins Wolverine's combat system, and it excelled because of it. They succeeded in finally having that beast-like fierceness that lets the player unleash. Beyond that, there's really not much else to dig your claws into. There are some cool God of War-like set pieces, but there's no denying that the combat system is the star of the show, and it alone makes it worth checking out. Not just for fans of the character, but for fans of good action games. I can't wait to see how Insomniac expands on this character from a gameplay standpoint. I'd love to see some stealth options. And to give X2 Wolverine's Revenge some credit, I think it implemented Wolverine's feral senses a lot better. letting you track enemies' patrol patterns by their footprints. Maybe Insomniac can also expand on that. Is X2 Wolverine's Revenge better than I remember? Nah. Maybe I will make a video where I bully the shit out of that game.